Martha, you're too old to live here anymore. It's time you moved to one of those senior places where you can get proper care. That's what my daughter-in-law Jessica declared right in front of my son Michael and my 2 grandchildren, completely unaware that the confused old woman she was trying to force into a nursing home actually owned the mortgage on the house she was standing in, along with 12 other rental properties across Portland that generated more monthly income than Michael's engineering salary. But what Jessica didn't know was that the simple manila envelope I quietly placed on their kitchen counter contained documents that would make her realize she had just made the most expensive assumption about age and capability in her entire life, one that would cost her the dream home she thought she was protecting from her burdensome mother-in-law. My name is Martha Elizabeth Hartwell, and I'm 73 years old. If you had walked into my son's beautiful 4-bedroom colonial house in Portland's Laurelhurst neighborhood that gray November afternoon, you would have seen exactly what Jessica saw: an elderly woman moving slowly around the kitchen with a slight tremor in her hands, wearing a faded cardigan that had seen better days, struggling to remember where Michael kept the coffee filters, and appearing increasingly confused by the modern appliances that seemed to beep and flash in ways that overwhelmed someone from a different generation. You would have watched me fumble with my old flip phone, squinting at the tiny screen while holding it at arm's length because I'd apparently forgotten my reading glasses again. You might have noticed how I asked Jessica to repeat herself multiple times during conversations, not because I couldn't hear her, but because I seemed to have trouble processing information quickly enough to keep up with normal conversation speed. You would have observed me napping frequently in Michael's recliner, appearing exhausted by simple activities like folding laundry or preparing a cup of tea. If you had been there during the previous 3 months since I'd moved in after my accident, you would have seen an elderly woman who seemed to be declining rapidly, both mentally and physically. You would have witnessed my apparent confusion about basic household routines, my tendency to repeat the same stories multiple times as if I couldn't remember telling them before, and my increasing dependence on Jessica and Michael for help with tasks that should have been simple for any independent adult. You might have felt sorry for this gray-haired grandmother who seemed to be losing her grip on independence and dignity, becoming more childlike and helpless with each passing week. You would have seen Jessica's growing frustration with having to constantly assist someone who couldn't remember how to operate the dishwasher, who left the stove on after cooking, and who seemed genuinely confused about which day of the week it was, or whether she had taken her medications. You would have watched Michael's shoulders sag with the weight of watching his mother's apparent cognitive decline, seeing him exchange worried glances with Jessica when I couldn't remember the names of neighbors I'd supposedly known for years, or when I became disoriented trying to find the bathroom in a house I'd been living in for 3 months. You might have heard their whispered conversations about what to do about Mom, and their research into local senior living facilities that could provide the proper care that I obviously needed. You would have observed Jessica's patience wearing thin as she dealt with what appeared to be an increasingly demanding elderly woman who required constant supervision and assistance, who interrupted family routines with her needs and confusion, and who seemed to be transforming their comfortable home into something that resembled a nursing facility with its pill organizers, mobility aids, and medical appointments that dominated their family calendar. If you had been present during family dinners, you would have seen Jessica gently but firmly correcting my apparent mistakes, explaining things to me multiple times as if I were a child, and taking over tasks that I started but couldn't seem to complete successfully. You might have noticed how she spoke to me in the slightly louder, more simplified language that people use with elderly individuals who seem to be struggling with comprehension. You would have witnessed moments when I appeared to become confused or agitated, requiring Jessica to calm me down and redirect me towards safer, simpler activities. You might have seen me become frustrated with my own limitations, sometimes crying quietly when I couldn't remember how to do things that should have been automatic, or becoming defensive when Jessica tried to help me with tasks I insisted I could handle myself, but clearly couldn't. You would have observed the family's growing concern about my safety, especially after the incident when I supposedly left the front door unlocked all night, or when Jessica found me wandering around the kitchen at 3 a.m. because I'd gotten confused about whether it was morning or evening. You might have heard their discussions about installing safety devices, removing potential hazards, and essentially child-proofing their home to protect me from my own declining judgment. And most tellingly, you would have seen their financial stress as they realized that caring for an elderly family member with increasing needs was expensive and time-consuming in ways they hadn't anticipated. You might have overheard their conversations about the cost of in-home care, the price of quality assisted living facilities, and their research into Medicare coverage for the various services that I apparently required. You would have watched Jessica calculate the family budget to account for my medical expenses, prescription costs, and the special foods and equipment that my condition seemed to require. You might have seen Michael postponing his own plans and purchases, as the family resources were redirected toward accommodating my needs and ensuring my safety and comfort. During those 3 months, you would have observed what appeared to be a textbook case of elderly cognitive decline affecting not just the individual, but the entire family system, that suddenly found itself responsible for someone who could no longer live independently, but wasn't quite ready for institutional care. You would have seen the emotional toll, the financial pressure, the logistical challenges, and the difficult conversations about long-term planning that families face when aging parents begin to lose their capabilities. You might have even admired Jessica's dedication to caring for her mother-in-law, despite the obvious burden it placed on her own life and family. You would have seen her researching dementia care techniques, attending support groups for family caregivers, and trying to balance compassion for my apparent condition with realistic assessment of what level of care our family could provide at home versus what might require professional intervention. You would have witnessed Michael struggling with guilt about potentially placing his mother in a care facility, even as it became increasingly clear that our current arrangement wasn't sustainable for anyone involved. You might have seen him trying to honor his father's deathbed promise to, quote, take care of mom, while also protecting his own family's well-being and financial security. And you would have been there on that gray November afternoon when Jessica finally reached her breaking point and made the announcement that would change everything. Martha, you're too old to live here anymore. It's time you move to one of those senior places where you can get proper care. From Jessica's perspective, this wasn't cruelty. It was practical necessity. She had spent 3 months watching me decline, helping me with increasingly basic tasks, and realizing that our family lacked the resources and expertise to provide the level of care that my condition seemed to require. She had researched facilities, visited several options, and found what appeared to be excellent care communities that specialized in supporting elderly individuals with cognitive challenges. Jessica had prepared a folder full of brochures from assisted living facilities that offered memory care services, social activities designed for seniors, and medical support that she believed would improve my quality of life while relieving the family of responsibilities they weren't equipped to handle. She had calculated the costs, investigated financial assistance programs, and even identified a facility that had immediate availability and came highly recommended by Michael's colleagues, who had faced similar decisions with their own aging parents. From her perspective, the conversation that afternoon was the culmination of weeks of careful planning and research, delivered with compassion and practical wisdom. She genuinely believed she was advocating for what was best for everyone involved, that I would receive better care in a professional facility, that Michael would be freed from the guilt and stress of watching his mother's decline, and that their own family could return to normal routines without the constant worry and disruption that my presence had created. Jessica had even arranged for us to tour 3 different facilities the following week, complete with meetings with social workers who could explain the transition process and help make the move as smooth as possible for everyone. She had spoken with financial advisors about liquidating whatever modest assets I might have to pay for care, and she had researched the legal requirements for families who needed to make care decisions for elderly relatives who might not be capable of making those decisions independently. What Jessica saw that afternoon was an elderly woman who had clearly reached the point where independent living was no longer safe or realistic, and a family situation that had become unsustainable despite everyone's best intentions. She saw the need for difficult but necessary decisions about long-term care, made with love and practical wisdom, even though they were emotionally challenging for everyone involved. But what Jessica didn't see, what she couldn't have imagined, and what she was about to discover in the most shocking way possible, was that every single assumption she had made about my condition, my capabilities, and my circumstances was not just wrong. It was deliberately and strategically constructed to test exactly how she and Michael would treat an elderly family member they believed was vulnerable and dependent on their care and generosity. The quote, confused old woman who couldn't remember how to operate a dishwasher had spent 45 years building and managing one of the most successful residential real estate portfolios in Oregon. The elderly mother who seemed overwhelmed by modern technology was actually monitoring property management systems, rental income, and market analyses through secure apps on devices that Jessica had never seen, because I kept my business equipment locked in a briefcase that she assumed contained old photo albums and personal mementos. The woman who appeared to be struggling with memory and cognitive function had actually been documenting every conversation, every instance of condescension, every moment when my supposed limitations were used to justify decisions made without my input or consent. The quote, declining mother-in-law who seemed to require constant assistance had been carefully observing how her family treated someone they believed was powerless to resist their control or challenge their assumptions. And the simple manila envelope I placed on the kitchen counter while Jessica was explaining the benefits of professional care contained documents that would prove I wasn't just mentally sharp, I was the financial backbone that had been supporting their lifestyle in ways they never suspected, the property owner who controlled their housing security, and the strategic thinker who had orchestrated the most comprehensive test of character they would ever experience. But before I reveal the contents of that envelope and the moment when Jessica's world turned upside down, you need to understand how I had reached this point, why I had chosen to stage my own decline, and what I had learned about my family during those 3 months that would determine their future in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. Because sometimes the most important questions aren't about whether elderly people can take care of themselves, they're about whether their families can be trusted to take care of them when they actually need it. And what happens when someone with real power decides to find out exactly who their loved ones really are when they think no one is watching? To truly understand the devastation that was about to unfold when Jessica discovered the truth about my capabilities, you need to see the world exactly as she and Michael saw it during those 3 months. You need to understand how reasonable their assumptions seemed, how logical their decisions appeared, and how completely convinced they were that they were dealing with a declining elderly woman who needed their protection and care. From Jessica's perspective, she was watching her mother-in-law experience what appeared to be a textbook case of age-related cognitive decline accelerated by a traumatic brain injury. Everything she observed seemed to confirm the medical literature she had researched about concussion recovery in elderly patients. And every interaction we had reinforced her growing certainty that I was becoming someone who could no longer live independently or make important decisions about my own welfare. When Jessica looked at me fumbling with the coffee maker each morning, she didn't see a successful businesswoman who had negotiated million-dollar real estate deals. She saw an elderly woman whose brain injury had affected her ability to process sequential instructions and operate familiar appliances. When she watched me struggle with the television remote, she didn't see someone who managed complex property management software across multiple platforms. She saw cognitive confusion that made even simple technology overwhelming and frightening. The tremor in my hands that made it difficult for me to button sweaters wasn't strategic performance in Jessica's eyes. It was neurological damage from my fall that was affecting my fine motor control and making basic self-care increasingly challenging. My apparent confusion about which day of the week it was didn't suggest someone who was testing their family's patience. It indicated disorientation and memory problems that were likely to worsen over time. When Jessica heard me asking the same questions repeatedly throughout the day, she saw short-term memory impairment that made it impossible for me to retain new information. When she watched me become frustrated and tearful over tasks that should have been simple, she observed the emotional instability that often accompanies cognitive decline in elderly individuals who are losing their independence and dignity. From her perspective, my increasing dependency on their help wasn't manipulation. It was the natural progression of someone whose capabilities were diminishing and who needed family support to remain safe and functional. My apparent gratitude for their assistance seemed like the appropriate response from someone who recognized that she could no longer manage alone and was thankful for relatives who were willing to take on the burden of her care. Jessica's growing impatience with my needs wasn't callousness in her own mind. It was the realistic stress response of someone who had suddenly found herself responsible for providing elder care without training, preparation, or adequate resources. She believed she was coping as well as anyone could with a situation that had transformed her home into a care facility and her daily routine into constant supervision of someone whose judgment could no longer be trusted. When Jessica spoke to me in louder, simpler language, she wasn't being condescending. She was adapting her communication style to accommodate what appeared to be my declining ability to process complex information. When she explained things multiple times with decreasing patience, she was dealing with what seemed to be genuine memory problems that made normal conversation frustrating and inefficient for everyone involved. Jessica's research into assisted living facilities wasn't abandonment. It was responsible planning for someone whose needs were exceeding what family care could reasonably provide. She had visited memory care units, spoken with social workers, and investigated the best available options for elderly individuals with cognitive challenges. She had calculated costs, explored insurance coverage, and identified facilities that specialized in supporting people exactly like what she believed I had become. Her conversations with Michael about my future weren't conspiracies against me. They were the difficult discussions that loving families have when they realize that home care isn't adequate for someone's safety and well-being. Jessica genuinely believed that professional care would improve my quality of life while protecting me from the dangers of living with people who lacked the expertise to manage my complex medical and psychological needs. When Jessica told friends and family about the challenges of caring for me, she wasn't complaining about a burden. She was seeking support and advice from people who had experience with eldercare issues. She attended caregiver support groups, where she learned strategies for managing the behavioral and emotional problems that often accompany cognitive decline. She read books about dementia care and researched techniques for maintaining dignity and comfort for elderly individuals whose capabilities were diminishing. From Jessica's perspective, her growing frustration with my presence in their home wasn't selfishness. It was the natural result of watching her marriage and family life become subordinated to the needs of someone whose condition was likely to worsen rather than improve. She saw her own children's routines disrupted by the constant attention I required, her husband's stress levels increasing as he watched his mother's apparent decline, and her household becoming focused around medical appointments, safety modifications, and crisis management. Jessica's financial concerns about my care weren't greed. They were a realistic assessment of the costs associated with providing appropriate support for someone with serious cognitive impairment. She had researched the price of in-home care, the expense of medical equipment and safety modifications, and the long-term financial impact of supporting someone whose needs would likely increase over time. Her calculations about my modest assets weren't scheming. They were practical planning for how to fund the level of care that my condition seemed to require. When Jessica discussed the legal aspects of elder care with Michael, she wasn't plotting to control me. She was learning about guardianship laws and family responsibility requirements that might become necessary if my cognitive decline continued. She researched power of attorney documents, medical decision-making procedures, and the legal protections available for elderly individuals who could no longer advocate for themselves effectively. Most importantly, from Jessica's perspective, her decision to tell me that I was too old to live here wasn't cruelty or rejection. It was the culmination of 3 months of careful observation, research, and planning that had led her to conclude that professional care was not just preferable but necessary for my safety and well-being. She believed she was making a difficult but loving decision that would benefit everyone involved, even though it required her to deliver news that she knew would be emotionally challenging for me to accept. Jessica had prepared for that conversation by gathering information about the transition process, arranging tours of appropriate facilities, and developing a timeline that would allow me to adjust gradually to the idea of moving to a care community. She had consulted with social workers about how to present the decision in ways that would minimize trauma and maintain my dignity throughout the transition process. She had even planned to involve me in choosing between different facilities, selecting personal items to make my new room feel home-like, and maintaining connections with family and friends that would help me feel supported rather than abandoned. Jessica genuinely believed she was advocating for what was best for me, even though it meant making decisions that she knew I might initially resist due to my apparent cognitive limitations. But Michael's perspective during those 3 months was even more heartbreaking, because his view of my decline was colored by grief, guilt, and the weight of promises he had made to his father about caring for me in my old age. When Michael looked at me, he didn't just see someone who needed help. He saw the gradual loss of the strong, capable woman who had raised him, and the approaching reality that he might soon lose his mother to the same kind of cognitive decline that had affected his grandmother in her final years. Michael's patience with my apparent confusion came from love, but also from the devastating recognition that his mother was becoming someone different from the person he had always known and respected. When he helped me with simple tasks that I couldn't seem to manage alone, he was mourning the independence and dignity that he believed I was losing through no fault of my own. His discussions with Jessica about my future weren't just practical planning. They were attempts to honor his father's deathbed request to take care of Mom, while also acknowledging that the level of care I seemed to need was beyond what he could provide at home. Michael genuinely believed that finding professional care for me was a way of ensuring that his father's wishes were fulfilled, even though the circumstances had changed in ways that no one could have anticipated. When Michael watched me struggle with daily activities, he saw his own future and worried about who would care for him if he experienced similar decline. When he observed my apparent confusion and memory problems, he grieved for the conversations we could no longer have and the relationship that seemed to be slipping away as my cognitive abilities diminished. Michael's stress about the financial aspects of my care wasn't resentment about supporting me. It was anxiety about his ability to provide the quality of care that he believed I deserved. He researched the best available facilities, not because he wanted me out of his home, but because he wanted to ensure that I would receive professional support that would maintain my comfort and dignity better than his amateur efforts could achieve. His conversations with Jessica about timing and logistics weren't conspiracies. They were the practical discussions that adult children have when they realize that their parents' needs have exceeded what family care can reasonably provide. Michael was trying to balance his love for me, his respect for my autonomy, his promise to his father, and his recognition that my safety and well-being required expertise that he didn't possess. Even more telling was how my apparent decline affected Michael's children, my grandchildren, Emma and Jake. From their perspective, they were watching their grandmother become someone different, someone who couldn't remember their friends' names, who needed help with things that used to be easy for her, and who sometimes seemed confused about where she was or what was happening around her. 10-year-old Emma's attempts to help me with simple tasks weren't condescension. They were a child's natural response to seeing someone she loved struggling with things that should have been easy. When she spoke to me slowly and clearly, she was trying to be helpful in the same way she had been taught to be patient with younger children or classmates who needed extra assistance. 12-year-old Jake's increasing distance from me wasn't rejection. It was a child's way of coping with the frightening reality that adults he loved could become vulnerable and dependent. His discomfort around me reflected his confusion about how to interact with someone who seemed to be losing the capabilities that had always defined her role in his life. Both children overheard their parents' worried conversations about my condition and their research into care facilities. From their perspective, their parents were trying to help their grandmother get the medical support she needed, even though it was sad and difficult for everyone involved. They didn't see conspiracy or manipulation. They saw adults making hard decisions about someone they loved who could no longer make those decisions effectively for herself. The children's teachers and friends' parents who met me during those 3 months also saw exactly what Jessica and Michael saw, an elderly woman experiencing cognitive decline who was fortunate to have family members willing to provide care and support during a difficult transition. When I appeared confused during school events or family gatherings, other adults attributed my behavior to the head injury and aging process that Michael and Jessica had explained. Even the medical professionals who interacted with me during that period saw nothing suspicious about my condition or my family's response to it. The family doctor who conducted my follow-up appointments after the supposed concussion observed symptoms that were consistent with brain injury recovery in elderly patients. The physical therapist who worked with me on balance and coordination issues noted cognitive challenges that seemed appropriate for someone my age who had experienced head trauma. The pharmacist who filled my prescriptions saw medication regimens that were typical for elderly individuals managing multiple health conditions. The home health aide who visited twice a week to help with bathing and personal care observed exactly what she expected to see: an elderly woman whose family was providing loving support during a period of increased dependency. None of these professionals questioned my family's plans for my care, because everything they observed seemed to confirm that I was someone whose needs were becoming too complex for home management. Their recommendations for specialized care and family support were based on what appeared to be legitimate medical and safety concerns, rather than any suspicion that my condition might be performance rather than genuine decline. The neighbors who occasionally interacted with me during my walks around the block saw an elderly woman who moved slowly, seemed occasionally disoriented, and was fortunate to have family members who supervised her activities and ensured her safety. When Jessica or Michael accompanied me on these outings, Other residents of their neighborhood saw responsible adult children taking appropriate precautions with an aging parent who could no longer be trusted to navigate the world independently. The salespeople at stores where Jessica took me for errands and appointments saw exactly what thousands of other retail workers see every day: an elderly customer who needed extra time and assistance, who seemed confused by simple transactions, and who was fortunate to have a patient family member helping her manage tasks that had become overwhelming. When Jessica spoke for me or made decisions about purchases, they saw appropriate advocacy for someone whose judgment and communication skills had become unreliable. Even the staff at the assisted living facilities that Jessica researched saw nothing unusual about our situation when we toured their memory care units and discussed admission procedures. They dealt with hundreds of families making similar decisions about elderly relatives whose cognitive abilities had declined to the point where professional care was necessary for safety and quality of life. My apparent confusion during facility tours and my emotional responses to discussions about placement seemed completely normal for someone facing the difficult transition from independent living to supervised care. The social workers, financial advisors, and legal professionals who consulted with Michael and Jessica about elder care planning saw a typical family dealing with the complex challenges of caring for an aging parent whose needs had exceeded what home care could provide. Their advice about guardianship procedures, asset management, and care transition planning was based on their assumption that I was someone who could no longer make informed decisions about my own welfare and finances. Insurance representatives who discussed coverage for my care saw documentation of cognitive decline that justified recommendations for specialized services and support systems. Medical equipment suppliers who delivered safety devices and mobility aids to Michael's house saw a family making appropriate preparations for an elderly relative whose physical and cognitive limitations required environmental modifications and assistive technology. From every professional and social perspective, Michael and Jessica appeared to be handling a difficult situation with appropriate care, research, and planning. Their decisions seemed not just reasonable, but commendable, given the challenges of providing elder care without professional training or unlimited resources. Their stress and frustration seemed natural and understandable, rather than evidence of character flaws or lack of compassion. Most telling of all was how completely convinced Jessica and Michael had become of their own perceptions. They weren't just pretending to believe I was declining. They had genuinely convinced themselves that everything they observed confirmed their assumptions about my condition. They had interpreted every interaction through the lens of cognitive impairment, and they had explained away any evidence that contradicted their conclusions about my limitations. When I demonstrated detailed knowledge about topics that should have been beyond my apparent cognitive abilities, they assumed I was accessing old memories rather than current expertise. When I showed frustration with their treatment of me, they attributed my emotional responses to the confusion and agitation that often accompany dementia. When I asked questions about their plans for my care, they saw anxiety and fear rather than strategic information gathering. Their certainty about my condition was so complete that they never considered the possibility that my behavior might be intentional rather than symptomatic. They never questioned whether someone with my apparent limitations could be capable of strategic thinking, careful planning, or sophisticated deception. They never wondered whether the woman they were observing might be different from the woman they thought they knew. And that absolute certainty, that complete conviction that they understood my situation and were making appropriate decisions for my welfare, was exactly what made the revelation in that manila envelope so perfectly devastating when it finally came. Because Jessica and Michael hadn't just made mistakes about my condition, they had built their entire understanding of our family relationships on assumptions that were not just wrong, but deliberately constructed to test exactly how they would treat someone they believed was vulnerable and dependent on their care. They had passed 3 months demonstrating their true character when they thought no one was keeping score, revealing their attitudes about elder care, dignity, and family responsibility when they believed their choices couldn't be challenged or their assumptions questioned. And they were about to discover that the confused, declining elderly woman they had been planning to place in professional care was actually someone who had been evaluating their character, documenting their choices, and preparing consequences that would match exactly how they had chosen to treat someone they believed was powerless to resist their decisions. The most expensive lessons are often the ones about assumptions, and Jessica and Michael were about to receive an education that would cost them everything they thought they understood about their own family, their own character, and their own future. November 23rd arrived with the crisp autumn air that made Portland's fall season so beautiful, but But inside Michael and Jessica's house, the atmosphere was heavy with the tension of a decision that had been building for weeks. Jessica had spent the morning preparing for what she believed would be a difficult but necessary conversation about my future, while I had spent those same hours preparing for the revelation that would destroy every assumption they had made about their family dynamics, their financial security, and their understanding of who I really was. At 2 p.m., Jessica asked me to join her and Michael in the living room for what she described as an important family discussion. I could see that she had prepared for this moment. She had arranged several brochures for assisted living facilities on the coffee table, along with a folder of documents about care options and a legal pad where she had apparently written notes about how to present their decision. Michael sat beside Jessica on the couch, his expression showing the conflict between duty to his mother and support for his wife's practical assessment of our situation. The children had been sent to spend the afternoon with friends, ensuring that this conversation would happen without witnesses who might be upset by the discussion of sending their grandmother away. "Martha," Jessica began, her voice taking on the carefully modulated tone she had perfected for delivering difficult news to someone she believed had limited cognitive abilities. "Michael and I have been thinking about your care needs and what would be best for your health and safety." I nodded attentively, playing the role of the confused but compliant elderly woman who was grateful for their guidance and concerned about their well-being. "Of course, dear. I know I've been a burden on your family." "You're not a burden, Mom," Michael said quickly, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "But we're worried that we might not be able to provide the level of care that you need, especially after what happened last week." Jessica leaned forward, her expression earnest and sympathetic. "Martha, we've been researching care communities that specialize in helping people with memory challenges and cognitive support needs. There are some wonderful places that have trained staff, medical facilities, and programs designed specifically for people in situations like yours." Quote. I allowed my expression to show confusion and fear, as if I didn't fully understand what they were suggesting. "Care communities? I don't understand what you mean." "Martha," Jessica said, her voice becoming more direct as she realized this conversation was going to require clear, explicit language. "We think it would be best for everyone if you move to a place where professionals can take care of you properly. You need more help than we can provide at home." I stared at Jessica for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "Are you saying you don't want me to live here anymore?" "It's not about what we want, Martha," Jessica replied, her patience already beginning to fray. "It's about what's safe and appropriate for someone with your condition. You're getting confused more often, you've had several incidents that could have been dangerous, and we're not trained to deal with the kind of problems you're having." "But this is Michael's house," I said, allowing my voice to sound small and uncertain. "Michael is my son. Doesn't he want his mother to live with him?" Michael shifted uncomfortably, caught between his loyalty to Jessica and his guilt about the decision they were making. "Mom, of course I want you to be safe and happy. But Jessica is right. We're not qualified to provide the kind of care you need. These facilities have doctors and nurses and people who understand how to help with memory problems." "Memory problems," I repeated slowly, as if testing the words. "Is that what you think is wrong with me?" "Martha," Jessica said with forced patience, "you've been having increasing difficulty with daily tasks, you've gotten confused about basic safety issues, and last week you wandered away from the house and couldn't remember where you were or how you got there. These are serious symptoms that require professional evaluation and care." I nodded slowly, appearing to process this information with the limited cognitive abilities they believed I possessed. "And you think I should go live with strangers instead of with my family?" "They wouldn't be strangers for long," Jessica said, her tone becoming more encouraging. "These facilities have social programs and activities that would help you make friends and stay engaged. You might actually be happier there than you are here." "Happier," I echoed, "because I'm not happy here." Quote. Jessica's expression showed a flash of irritation at my apparent inability to understand the logic of their decision. "Martha, you're not unhappy here, but you're becoming a safety risk for yourself and potentially for our family. We can't provide 24-hour supervision, we don't have medical training, and we can't continue to manage the kind of crises that have been happening." "What kind of crises?" "Martha, just last week you left the house in the middle of the evening and we couldn't find you for almost an hour. You could have been hurt, you could have gotten lost, you could have been hit by a car. We can't live in constant fear that something terrible is going to happen. I appeared to consider this information carefully, as if I were trying to understand concepts that were beyond my cognitive abilities. So you think I'm dangerous? Not dangerous intentionally, Michael said quickly, but Mom, your judgment isn't what it used to be, and you're having trouble remembering important safety rules. It's not your fault, but it's not safe for anyone. I see, I said quietly, and when would I have to leave? Jessica and Michael exchanged glances, clearly relieved that I seemed to be accepting their decision without the emotional outburst they had been prepared to manage. We've scheduled tours at 3 facilities for next week, Jessica said, consulting her notes. Once we find the right place and complete the admission process, we could probably arrange for you to move within 2 or 3 weeks. 2 or 3 weeks, I repeated. And what happens to my things? My belongings? You can bring personal items that are important to you, Jessica explained. Most care facilities have furnished rooms, so you won't need furniture, but you can bring photographs, clothes, and personal mementos that will help your room feel homelike. And what about my finances? How will I pay for this care? Jessica's expression became slightly uncomfortable, as if she had been hoping to avoid this particular aspect of the conversation. Martha, we've looked into the costs, and we think your savings and Social Security should cover most of the expenses. There might be some additional costs that we'll need to help with, but we'll figure out a way to make it work. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the point where Jessica revealed her assumptions about my financial resources and her willingness to make major decisions about my money without my informed consent. How do you know about my savings? I asked innocently. Well, we don't know the exact amounts, Michael said carefully, but we've made some estimates based on what Dad left you and what you might have been able to save over the years. We'll need to review your accounts and work with the facility's financial advisors to set up payment arrangements. You want to review my accounts? Martha, if you're going to live in a care facility, someone needs to manage your finances and make sure your bills are paid properly, Jessica explained. Michael and I can help with that, or we can arrange for a professional financial guardian if you prefer. The casual way Jessica discussed taking control of my finances revealed everything I needed to know about how she viewed my autonomy and decision-making capacity. She was already planning to assume authority over my money, my living situation, and my personal choices based on her assessment of my cognitive limitations. I understand, I said quietly. You think I'm too old and too confused to live here, and you want to put me in a facility where other people will take care of me and manage my money. Martha, we're trying to do what's best for everyone, Jessica said, her tone becoming sharper as she interpreted my summary as resistance to their carefully planned decision. This isn't about what we want. It's about what you need. And you've decided what I need without asking me what I want? Martha, we have asked you what you want, but your answers haven't been consistent or realistic. Last week you said you wanted to go home to your apartment, but you don't have an apartment anymore. You've been living here for 3 months. I see, I said thoughtfully. So because my answers don't make sense to you, you've decided that my opinions don't matter? Jessica's patience was clearly running out. Martha, your opinions do matter, but we have to balance what you say you want against what's actually safe and possible. You can't live alone, you can't manage complex daily tasks, and you can't be left unsupervised without risk of injury or getting lost. And so you've concluded that I'm no longer competent to make decisions about my own life? Martha, we're not saying you're incompetent, Michael said, though his tone suggested that was exactly what they were saying. We're saying you need help making good decisions about your care and safety. Help, I repeated, from people who will decide what's best for me whether I agree or not. Jessica's expression showed her frustration with what appeared to be my stubborn refusal to accept their logical, well-researched decision about my care needs. Martha, you're too old to live here anymore. It's time you move to one of those senior places where you can get proper care, she said, her voice carrying the finality of someone who had exhausted her patience with negotiation and was now simply announcing a decision that had already been made. Those words, "You're too old to live here," contained everything I needed to hear. Jessica had revealed her true attitude about aging, about family responsibility, and about the value of elderly people who she believed had become burdens rather than family members deserving of respect and consideration. I sat quietly for a moment, appearing to absorb the impact of Jessica's declaration while actually savoring the perfect setup she had just provided for the revelation that would change all of their lives. "Jessica," I said finally, my voice still soft and uncertain, "before I agree to move to a care facility, could I show you something? Something that might affect your decision about my living arrangements?" Jessica and Michael exchanged glances that suggested they were prepared for emotional manipulation, tearful pleading, or desperate attempts to avoid the consequences of my apparent cognitive decline. "Of course, Martha," Jessica said with forced patience. "What would you like to show us?" I stood up slowly, using the careful movements of someone who was unsteady on her feet, and walked to the kitchen counter where I had placed a large manila envelope earlier that morning. I returned to the living room and sat down across from Jessica and Michael, holding the envelope in my lap. "Jessica, Michael, I need to share some information with you that might change how you think about my living situation and my ability to make decisions about my own care." I opened the envelope and withdrew the first document, a comprehensive financial statement from my investment management firm showing total assets of $8.7 million as of the previous week. I placed the document on the coffee table between us, arranging it so that the total asset figure was clearly visible. The silence that followed was absolute and profound. Jessica stared at the document for what felt like several minutes, her eyes moving from the header to the asset summary to the detailed property listings that filled 3 pages of dense financial information. "Martha," she whispered finally, "what is this?" "This is my financial statement, Jessica. My actual financial statement, showing the real estate properties I own and the current value of my investment portfolio." Michael leaned forward to examine the document, his face showing complete bewilderment as he tried to process what he was seeing. "Mom, this says you have almost $9 million in assets. That can't be right." "Actually, Michael, that statement is from last week. The current value is probably closer to $9 million, given some recent property appreciations and a successful renovation project I completed this month." I reached into the envelope and withdrew additional documents, property deeds, rental income statements, business licenses, and professional correspondence that documented 30 years of sophisticated real estate investing and property management. "This is impossible," Jessica said, her voice barely audible. "You live in a small apartment. You teach English to children. You've been confused about basic daily tasks for 3 months. Jessica, I live in a luxury penthouse in the Pearl District that I own, along with 6 other units in the same building. I don't teach English. I haven't taught English in over 20 years, and I haven't been confused about anything. I've been testing your character by pretending to have cognitive problems that don't exist." The effect of this revelation was immediate and devastating. Jessica's face went completely white as she began to understand the magnitude of what I was telling her. "You've been pretending?" she whispered. "Jessica, for the past 3 months, I have been conducting the most comprehensive assessment of your character and Michael's character that I could design. Every instance of apparent confusion, every moment of seeming helplessness, every crisis that required your assistance, was carefully planned to reveal how you treat elderly family members when you believe they're vulnerable and dependent." I spread out more documents across the coffee table, detailed notes I had kept about their conversations, their decisions, and their attitudes toward my apparent needs. I documented every conversation where you discussed my future without asking for my input. I recorded every instance where you spoke to me as if I were a child, rather than an adult. I noted every decision you made about my care and my living situation based on your assumptions about my limitations rather than consultation about my preferences. Michael was staring at the documents with an expression of total shock and growing horror as he began to realize what my revelations meant about his own behavior over the past 3 months. "Mom, are you saying that there's nothing wrong with you, that you don't have memory problems or cognitive issues?" "Michael, there is absolutely nothing wrong with my cognitive abilities. I have been managing a complex business portfolio, making sophisticated investment decisions, and coordinating multiple construction and renovation projects while living in your house, and pretending to be confused about how to operate a coffee maker." I pulled out my phone, not the old flip phone Jessica and Michael had seen me using, but a current model smartphone with advanced features, and showed them the property management applications I use to monitor my business operations. While you were discussing my apparent inability to manage my own affairs, I was actually earning an average of $34,000 per month in rental income from properties I own across 3 states. Jessica was reading through the property deeds and rental agreements with increasing devastation as she realized that the, quote, confused old woman she had been planning to place in professional care was actually one of the most successful real estate investors in the region. "But the wandering episode," she said desperately. "You got lost and couldn't remember how to get home." "Jessica, I walked to the end of your street and sat on a bus bench for 45 minutes while you and Michael searched for me. I was never lost, never confused, and never in any danger. I was testing to see how you would respond to a crisis involving someone you believed was cognitively impaired." "The bathroom door," Michael said weakly. "You couldn't remember how to open the bathroom door." "Michael, I stood in that bathroom for 20 minutes waiting for you to find me, and then I pretended to be confused about a door that I could have opened at any time. I was documenting your response to what appeared to be a cognitive emergency." Quote, "I reached into the envelope one final time and withdrew a document that I placed directly in front of Jessica, a revised will that I had prepared the previous week. Jessica, this is my updated will, reflecting the changes I've made based on my observations of your character over the past 3 months." Jessica's hands were shaking as she picked up the document and began reading. I watched her face change as she realized what the legal language meant for her family's future. "According to this will, Michael," I continued, "you have been completely excluded from my estate. The house you're living in, which you believed you would inherit, will be sold upon my death, and the proceeds donated to organizations that support elder care and fight against ageism." Michael's face went ashen as he understood the financial implications of what I was telling him. "The business assets, the real estate portfolio, and the investment accounts that would have provided financial security for your family will instead be used to establish a foundation that provides housing assistance for elderly individuals who have been mistreated by their families." "Mom, you can't be serious," Michael whispered. "Michael, I am completely serious. The son who spent 3 months treating his mother like a burden while planning to control her finances and living arrangements will inherit exactly what he demonstrated his mother was worth to him: nothing." "But what about Emma and Jake?" Jessica asked desperately. "Emma and Jake will be provided for through educational trusts that you cannot access or control. They will receive excellent educations and have opportunities to build successful lives, but they will also receive education about treating elderly people with dignity and respect." I began gathering the documents and returning them to the manila envelope, preparing to leave their house for the final time. "Where are you going?" Michael asked, panic clear in his voice. "I'm going home, Michael. To my penthouse, where I will continue managing my business operations and living independently, as I have been doing successfully for the past 15 years. "Martha, please," Jessica said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Can't we talk about this? Can't we work something out?" "Jessica, there is nothing to work out. You spent 3 months demonstrating how you treat elderly family members when you believe they're powerless to resist your control. You revealed your character when you thought no one was keeping score. And that character doesn't deserve to benefit from wealth you tried to steal through manipulation." "But we were trying to help you," Jessica protested. "We thought you were sick. We thought we were doing what was best for you." "Jessica, you were doing what was most convenient for you. You never asked what I wanted. You never consulted me about decisions that would affect my life. You treated me like a child who couldn't be trusted to understand her own needs or preferences." I stood up and walked toward the door, carrying my envelope and my small suitcase. "Most importantly, Jessica, when you believed I was vulnerable and dependent, you chose control over compassion, convenience over consideration, and institutional care over family support. Those choices have consequences that you'll live with for the rest of your life." As I reached the front door, Michael made one final, desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Mom, please don't leave like this. We made mistakes, but we love you. Can't we start over and do better?" I turned to face my son one last time. "Michael, love doesn't manipulate vulnerable people. Love doesn't make major life decisions for other adults without their consent. Love doesn't treat family members as burdens to be managed rather than people to be respected. But I do love you, Mom." "Michael, what you showed me over the past 3 months wasn't love. It was obligation disguised as care, and control disguised as protection. When you thought I couldn't defend myself, you revealed who you really are, and that person doesn't deserve the inheritance you thought you were entitled to receive. I walked out of Michael and Jessica's house carrying the same small suitcase I had arrived with 3 months earlier, but leaving behind a family whose assumptions about aging, respect, and financial entitlement had just cost them everything they thought they could count on for their future security. 3 hours later, I was back in my luxury penthouse, resuming the business activities that had never actually stopped, and reviewing investment opportunities that would increase my wealth even further over the coming years. 6 months later, I received a letter from Michael that showed he had finally understood the magnitude of his miscalculation. "Mom," he wrote, "I've spent every day since you left thinking about what kind of person I became during those 3 months. I realize now that I didn't just lose an inheritance. I lost my relationship with the most remarkable woman I've ever known because I was too selfish and assumptions-driven to see who you really were." Michael went on to explain that Jessica had moved out and filed for divorce, unable to cope with the financial and emotional consequences of their treatment of me. He was working multiple jobs to keep their house, had enrolled in counseling to address his attitudes about aging and family responsibility, and was trying to become someone worthy of his children's respect. "I know I can never undo what I did or earn back your trust," he concluded. "But I want you to know that your lesson about consequences has changed how I think about family, respect, and the assumptions we make about people based on age or apparent circumstances. I hope someday I can prove that I learned something valuable from the most expensive mistake I'll ever make." I never responded to Michael's letter, but I did establish a scholarship program at Portland State University for students studying gerontology and elder advocacy, and I increased my donations to organizations that fight ageism and support elderly individuals who have been mistreated by their families. Because sometimes the most important investments are the ones that teach people lessons they desperately need to learn, even when those lessons cost more than they ever imagined they could afford. The woman Jessica thought was too old to live here had taught her family that respect isn't negotiable, dignity isn't optional, and treating people well isn't conditional on what you think they can do for you in return. And the simple manila envelope I left on their coffee table that November afternoon will serve as a permanent reminder that assumptions about people's worth based on age, appearance, or apparent circumstances can be the most expensive mistakes you ever make, especially when the person you're underestimating has spent 73 years proving exactly how wrong those assumptions can be. This story is dedicated to every elderly person who has ever been dismissed, underestimated, or treated as a burden by people who should have known better. Remember that age brings wisdom, experience, and often capabilities that younger people can't imagine. The most valuable lesson isn't about hidden wealth. It's about treating every person with dignity and respect, regardless of what you think they can or cannot do for you. If you or someone you know is experiencing elder abuse, financial exploitation, or family manipulation, resources are available through local adult protective services, elder law attorneys, and advocacy organizations that specialize in protecting the rights and dignity of older adults. Who occasionally interacted with me during my walks around the block, saw an elderly woman who moved slowly, seemed occasionally disoriented, and was fortunate to have family members who supervised her activities and ensured her safety. When Jessica or Michael accompanied me on these outings, other residents of their neighborhood saw responsible adult children taking appropriate precautions with an aging parent who could no longer be trusted to navigate the world independently. The salespeople at stores where Jessica took me for errands and appointments saw exactly what thousands of other retail workers see every day: an elderly customer who needed extra time and assistance, who seemed confused by simple transactions, and who was fortunate to have a patient family member helping her manage tasks that had become overwhelming. When Jessica spoke for me or made decisions about purchases, they saw appropriate advocacy for someone whose judgment and communication skills had become unreliable. Even the staff at the assisted living facilities that Jessica researched saw nothing unusual about our situation when we toured their memory care units and discussed admission procedures. They dealt with hundreds of families, making similar decisions about elderly relatives, whose cognitive abilities had declined to the point where professional care was necessary for safety and quality of life. My apparent confusion during facility tours and my emotional responses to discussions about placement seemed completely normal for someone facing the difficult transition from independent living to supervised care. The social workers, financial advisors, and legal professionals who consulted with Michael and Jessica about eldercare planning saw a typical family dealing with the complex challenges of caring for an aging parent whose needs had exceeded what home care could provide. Their advice about guardianship procedures, asset management, and care transition planning was based on their assumption that I was someone who could no longer make informed decisions about my own welfare and finances. Insurance representatives who discussed coverage for my care saw documentation of cognitive decline that justified recommendations for specialized services and support systems. Medical equipment suppliers who delivered safety devices and mobility aids to Michael's house saw a family making appropriate preparations for an elderly relative whose physical and cognitive limitations required environmental modifications and assistive technology. From every professional and social perspective, Michael and Jessica appeared to be handling a difficult situation with appropriate care, research, and planning. Their decisions seemed not just reasonable but commendable, given the challenges of providing elder care without professional training or unlimited resources. Their stress and frustration seemed natural and understandable, rather than evidence of character flaws or lack of compassion. Most telling of all was how completely convinced Jessica and Michael had become of their own perceptions. They weren't just pretending to believe I was declining. They had genuinely convinced themselves that everything they observed confirmed their assumptions about my condition. They had interpreted every interaction through the lens of cognitive impairment, and they had explained away any evidence that contradicted their conclusions about my limitations. When I demonstrated detailed knowledge about topics that should have been beyond my apparent cognitive abilities, they assumed I was accessing old memories rather than current expertise. When I showed frustration with their treatment of me, they attributed my emotional responses to the confusion and agitation that often accompany dementia. When I asked questions about their plans for my care, they saw anxiety and fear rather than strategic information gathering. Their certainty about my condition was so complete that they never considered the possibility that my behavior might be intentional rather than symptomatic. They never questioned whether someone with my apparent limitations could be capable of strategic thinking, careful planning, or sophisticated deception. They never wondered whether the woman they were observing might be different from the woman they thought they knew. And that absolute certainty, that complete conviction that they understood my situation and were making appropriate decisions for my welfare, was exactly what made the revelation in that manila envelope so perfectly devastating when it finally came. Because Jessica and Michael hadn't just made mistakes about my condition, they had built their entire understanding of our family relationships on assumptions that were not just wrong, but deliberately constructed to test exactly how they would treat someone they believed was vulnerable and dependent on their care. They had passed 3 months demonstrating their true character when they thought no one was keeping score, revealing their attitudes about elder care, dignity, and family responsibility when they believed their choices couldn't be challenged or their assumptions questioned. And they were about to discover that the confused, declining elderly woman they had been planning to place in professional care was actually someone who had been evaluating their character, documenting their choices, and preparing consequences that would match exactly how they had chosen to treat someone they believed was powerless to resist their decisions. The most expensive lessons are often the ones about assumptions, and Jessica and Michael were about to receive an education that would cost them everything they thought they understood about their own family, their own character, and their own future. Before I tell you how one envelope completely shattered my arrogant daughter-in-law's assumptions and turned her world upside down, please hit that like button and subscribe to support the channel. Also, drop a comment telling me about a time when someone dismissed you because of your age, gender, or appearance, only to discover they had completely underestimated who they were dealing with. Your stories inspire these videos, and I read every single comment because I believe everyone deserves to be heard and respected, regardless of what others assume about their capabilities. But to understand the full impact of what happened that November afternoon when Jessica told me I was too old to live here, you need to know how those 3 months of apparent decline had been carefully orchestrated from the very first day I moved into their house. Every stumble, every moment of confusion, every instance of seeming helplessness had been strategically designed to reveal the true character of the people who claimed to love me. It all began in August, when I called Michael with news that would set everything in motion. "Michael, sweetheart, I've had a little accident," I said, letting my voice shake just slightly as I spoke into the phone. I fell down the stairs in my apartment building, and the doctor says I have a mild concussion. Nothing serious, but they're concerned about me living alone for a while. The truth was that I had never fallen down any stairs. I had never had a concussion. And I certainly wasn't having any problems living alone in my supposed small apartment in Portland's Pearl District. But Michael didn't need to know that the apartment was actually a luxury penthouse that I owned in a building where I also owned 6 other units. Or that my accident was the carefully planned opening move in the most important experiment I would ever conduct. "Mom, that's terrible. Are you okay? Do you need me to come over? Should we take you to the emergency room?" Michael's immediate concern was genuine, and for a moment I felt a pang of guilt about the deception I was about to begin. No, sweetheart, I'm fine. The doctors have already looked at me. But they think it would be best if I stayed with family for a few weeks, just until I'm steady on my feet again. I know it's an imposition, but would it be possible for me to stay with you and Jessica for a little while? Quote. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear Jessica's voice in the background asking what was wrong. Michael explained the situation quickly, and I listened carefully to their hurried conversation about whether they had space, what it would mean for their routines, and how long a few weeks might actually be. Of course, Mom, Michael finally said, though I could hear the slight hesitation in his voice. You can stay in the guest room as long as you need. When do you want to come over? Would tomorrow be too soon? I'm sorry to be such trouble, but I'm honestly a little scared to be alone right now. The fall really shook me up. Tomorrow is perfect, Mom. Don't worry about being trouble. You're family. But even as Michael said those words, I could hear the strain in his voice that told me this invitation was more about obligation than genuine enthusiasm. That tone would become crucial evidence in the months ahead. The next morning, I arrived at Michael and Jessica's house with a single small suitcase and a worn handbag, playing the role of the grateful but slightly confused elderly woman who was overwhelmed by her circumstances and dependent on her family's generosity. I had spent the previous evening carefully selecting clothes that would reinforce the image I wanted to project. Outdated styles that suggested someone who hadn't bought new clothing in years, fabrics that had clearly seen better days, and colors that made me look pale and frail. "Mom, you look terrible," Jessica exclaimed when she opened the door, and her shock appeared genuine. "Are you sure you're feeling well enough to be up and around?" "I'm much better than I was yesterday," I replied weakly, allowing myself to sway slightly as if I were still unsteady. "The doctor said the dizziness should pass in a few days, but everything still feels a bit fuzzy, you know?" Jessica immediately took my arm to steady me, and I noted how naturally she shifted into a caretaking role when presented with someone who appeared to need assistance. This would be important information for later. "Let's get you settled in the guest room," Michael said, taking my suitcase. "You can rest as much as you need, and we'll take care of everything else." The guest room was lovely, decorated in soft blues and whites, with a comfortable queen bed, a reading chair by the window, and its own attached bathroom. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a perfectly pleasant place to stay. But for the experiment I was about to conduct, it would serve as my base of operations for the most comprehensive character assessment I had ever undertaken. "This is beautiful," I said, sitting heavily on the bed as if the short walk from the front door had exhausted me. "I can't tell you how much I appreciate this. I know having an old woman around isn't what you two planned for." "Don't be silly, Mom," Michael replied, though again I heard that slight edge in his voice that suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "We're happy to help." Jessica busied herself opening drawers and explaining where I could put my things, pointing out the bathroom amenities and showing me how to adjust the blinds and the bedside lamp. Her helpfulness seemed genuine, but I was already taking mental notes about her tendency to speak slowly and clearly, as if she assumed I might have trouble understanding normal conversation. "Now, Martha, you just make yourself at home," Jessica said, her voice taking on that slightly louder, more deliberate tone that people use with elderly individuals they believe might be cognitively impaired. "If you need anything at all, just call for us. We're usually in the kitchen or the living room." "You're so kind, Jessica. I promise I won't be any trouble." But even as I said those words, I was already planning exactly what kind of trouble I would become, and how I would use their responses to that trouble to learn everything I needed to know about their true character. Over the first week, I gradually introduced small signs of confusion and decline that would test their patience and reveal their attitudes toward elderly family members who needed assistance. I started by asking Jessica to repeat instructions multiple times, as if I couldn't quite grasp what she was telling me about mealtimes, house rules, or daily routines. "Jessica, dear, what time did you say dinner was again?" I would ask, even though she had just told me 5 minutes earlier. 6 o'clock, Martha. We eat dinner at 6 o'clock every day." 6 o'clock, yes, and what time is it now? Jessica would glance at the kitchen clock with barely concealed impatience. "It's 4:30, Martha, so dinner is in an hour and a half." "An hour and a half," I would repeat slowly, as if I were having trouble with the math. "So that would be, let me see, 6 o'clock, Martha. Dinner is at 6 o'clock." Quote. These small interactions allowed me to observe how quickly Jessica's patience wore thin when dealing with someone who seemed to need extra help with basic concepts. I noted that she rarely explained things twice with the same level of kindness, and that her voice grew sharper with each repetition. I also began demonstrating apparent confusion about household appliances and routines, fumbling with the coffee maker, struggling to remember which cabinet held the dishes, and appearing overwhelmed by the television remote control. Each instance of helplessness was carefully calculated to create opportunities for Jessica and Michael to reveal their true feelings about caring for someone they perceived as increasingly dependent. "Martha, you just pressed the red button to turn on the TV," Jessica would explain, demonstrating the process slowly. "The red button. See? Right here." "The red button," I would repeat, reaching for the remote with slightly shaking hands. "But there are so many buttons, Jessica, I don't want to break anything." "You won't break anything, Martha. It's just the red button. Just press it once." I would fumble with the remote, pretending to be confused by the array of buttons, occasionally pressing the wrong one and appearing startled when the channel changed or the volume increased. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that." Jessica's sighs of frustration became longer and more frequent as the days passed, and I began to see how she truly felt about the interruption to her normal routines. When she thought I couldn't hear her, she would complain to Michael about how exhausting it was to explain simple things over and over, and how she felt like she was taking care of a child rather than an adult. "Michael, I know she's your mother, but I'm getting a little overwhelmed here," I overheard Jessica say during one of their bedroom conversations. "Everything takes twice as long when I have to explain it multiple times, and I feel like I can't leave her alone for more than a few minutes without something going wrong." "I know it's hard, Jess, but the doctor said the confusion should improve as she recovers from the concussion." "But what if it doesn't improve? What if this is her new normal? I'm not trained to take care of someone with cognitive problems, and honestly, I'm not sure I'm cut out for it." Quote. Their conversation revealed exactly what I needed to know about how they viewed elderly care as a burden rather than an opportunity to give back to someone who had spent decades caring for others. Jessica saw my apparent needs as an imposition on her lifestyle rather than a chance to show love and respect for her husband's mother. As the second week progressed, I escalated the complexity of my apparent difficulties, introducing problems that would require more time and patience to address. I began leaving kitchen appliances on after use, appearing to forget basic safety rules, and demonstrating increasing anxiety about tasks that should have been simple for any independent adult. "Jessica, I started some tea, but I can't remember if I turned off the stove," I would say, appearing genuinely worried about having made a dangerous mistake. Jessica would hurry to the kitchen to check, finding that I had indeed left the burner on under an empty kettle. "Martha, you have to be more careful about this. You could start a fire." "I'm so sorry, dear. I thought I turned it off, but everything is so confusing right now. Maybe I shouldn't be using the stove at all." "Maybe you shouldn't," Jessica would mutter under her breath, though she tried to hide her frustration from me. These incidents allowed me to observe how Jessica handled stress and responsibility when caring for someone she believed was becoming a safety risk. Rather than finding ways to help me maintain independence while staying safe, she increasingly tried to limit my access to anything that might require her to supervise or clean up after me. I also began demonstrating apparent memory problems that went beyond simple confusion, asking the same questions multiple times within short periods, appearing to forget conversations we had just finished, and seeming unable to retain new information about household routines or family plans. "Jessica, what did you say we were having for dinner tonight?" I would ask during breakfast. "Spaghetti, Martha. We're having spaghetti for dinner." 2 hours later. Jessica, dear, do you know what we're having for dinner? I can't seem to remember. Spaghetti, Martha. I told you this morning. We're having spaghetti. And then again in the afternoon. Jessica, I hate to be a bother, but what are we eating tonight? I know you told me, but I just can't hold on to the information. Quote, by this point, Jessica's response would be noticeably sharper. Martha, we are having spaghetti for dinner. Spaghetti, I've told you 3 times today. I'm sorry, dear. I don't mean to ask the same things over and over. My mind just feels so foggy lately. These repeated interactions revealed how Jessica truly felt about the mental effort required to care for someone with apparent cognitive difficulties. Rather than showing patience or understanding, she became increasingly irritated by what she saw as unnecessary demands on her time and attention. During the 3rd week, I introduced physical symptoms that would test their willingness to provide hands-on care and assistance with personal needs. I began moving more slowly around the house, appearing unsteady on my feet, and occasionally asking for help with tasks that required physical coordination or strength. Michael, could you help me reach that dish on the high shelf? I'm afraid I might fall if I try to stretch up there. Of course, Mom. Michael would help me immediately, but I noted that he seemed slightly annoyed by the interruption to whatever he had been doing. Jessica, would you mind helping me with this jar? My hands don't seem to have the strength they used to. Jessica would take the jar and open it quickly, but her body language suggested that she viewed these requests as interruptions rather than opportunities to help. She would hand the jar back to me with a slight edge of impatience, as if she were dealing with someone who was being deliberately helpless. I also began having apparent problems with coordination and fine motor skills, struggling to button sweaters, appearing confused by zippers, and having difficulty with tasks that required precise hand movements. These symptoms would require family members to either provide direct physical assistance or watch me struggle with basic self-care tasks. Martha, do you need help with that? Jessica would ask when she saw me fumbling with buttons, but her tone suggested that she hoped the answer would be no. I think I can manage, I would reply, continuing to struggle obviously, while Jessica watched with barely concealed frustration. Eventually, Jessica would step in to help, but her assistance came with subtle signs of resentment. Quick, efficient movements that got the task done as fast as possible, minimal eye contact, and an immediate return to her own activities as soon as the help was provided. By the end of the 3rd week, I had established a comprehensive pattern of apparent decline that tested every aspect of their willingness to provide elder care. I had observed their responses to cognitive confusion, memory problems, safety issues, physical limitations, and increased dependence on their time and attention. What I discovered was that neither Michael nor Jessica had any real understanding of how to care for elderly family members with dignity and respect. They viewed my apparent needs as burdens to be managed rather than opportunities to show love. They spoke to me as if I were a child, rather than an adult, who deserved to be treated with consideration. And most tellingly, they made decisions about my care and my future without ever asking what I wanted or needed. During the 4th week, their private conversations began to focus on long-term solutions, rather than temporary accommodation. I heard them discussing the costs of assisted living facilities, the legal requirements for placing elderly relatives in care, and their concerns about how long they could continue to provide the level of supervision that my condition seemed to require. We can't keep this up indefinitely, Jessica told Michael one evening after I had apparently forgotten to turn off the bathroom faucet and flooded the guest bathroom floor. Your mother needs professional care, not just family goodwill. I know you're right, but I feel terrible about the idea of putting her in a facility. Dad made me promise to take care of her. Michael, taking care of her doesn't mean destroying our own lives and marriage in the process. There are good facilities that specialize in memory care and cognitive support. She might actually be happier and safer there. Their conversation revealed that they were already planning to remove me from their home, not because I was truly unsafe or unhappy, but because caring for me had become inconvenient for their lifestyle. They were choosing institutional care as a solution to their own discomfort, rather than exploring ways to make home care work for everyone involved. This was the evidence I needed to understand exactly how my family would treat me if I ever actually needed their help and support. They would provide care reluctantly, with resentment and impatience, and they would look for the first opportunity to transfer responsibility to someone else, regardless of what I might want or need. During my final weeks in their home, I began preparing for the revelation that would show them exactly what their attitudes and assumptions had cost them. I started leaving hints about my real situation, making brief phone calls that suggested business activities, receiving mail that indicated financial complexity, and occasionally demonstrating knowledge or capabilities that contradicted their assumptions about my limitations. But Jessica and Michael were so convinced of my decline that they explained away any evidence that challenged their perceptions. When I demonstrated detailed knowledge about real estate markets during a casual conversation, Jessica assumed I was remembering information from decades past rather than current expertise. When I received official-looking mail from financial institutions, they assumed it was routine correspondence about modest savings accounts rather than communication about substantial business holdings. Their inability to see past their own assumptions about aging and cognitive decline revealed how completely they had dismissed me as a person worthy of respect and consideration. They had decided I was becoming incompetent, and they interpreted everything I said or did through that lens, never considering that their elderly mother-in-law might be far more capable and aware than they realized. And that's what made the moment of revelation so perfectly devastating when it finally arrived. Jessica and Michael had spent 3 months demonstrating exactly how they treated elderly family members they believed were vulnerable and dependent. They had shown their true character when they thought no one was keeping score. And they had revealed their priorities when they believed their decisions couldn't be challenged. The manila envelope I placed on their kitchen counter that November afternoon contained documentation that would prove not only that every assumption they had made about my condition was wrong, but that their treatment of me had been observed, evaluated, and found completely inadequate by someone who had the power to change their lives in ways they never imagined possible. Because the most important tests of character aren't the ones people know they're taking. They're the ones that reveal who someone really is when they think their choices don't have consequences. But if you really want to understand how Jessica reached the breaking point that led to her fateful declaration that I was too old to live here, you need to know about the events of November 15th, the day I decided to escalate my performance to a level that would force her to reveal her true character once and for all. It was the day I created what appeared to be a genuine crisis that would test every assumption they had made about my condition and every strategy they had developed for managing my care. November 15th began like any other morning during my 3-month residency in Michael and Jessica's home. I woke up at 6 a.m., as I had every day since arriving, but this time I had a specific plan that would push their patience and assumptions to the breaking point. Today would be the day that Jessica and Michael would be forced to confront exactly how far they were willing to go to control someone they believed was no longer capable of making decisions for herself. I started the morning by appearing more confused and disoriented than I had ever seemed before. When Jessica found me in the kitchen at 6:30 a.m., I was standing in front of the open refrigerator wearing only my nightgown and slippers, staring at the contents as if I had no idea why I was there or what I was looking for. Martha, what are you doing?" Jessica asked, her voice already tinged with the irritation that had become her default tone when dealing with my apparent problems. "I was looking for something," I replied, allowing my voice to sound thin and uncertain, "but I can't remember what it was. I thought maybe if I looked in here I would remember why I came to the kitchen." Jessica glanced at the clock and sighed deeply. It was earlier than I usually got up, and my appearance in the kitchen wearing inappropriate clothing suggested that my confusion was worsening in ways that might require more intensive supervision. "Martha, you're not dressed, and it's still very early. Why don't you go back to your room and get properly dressed, and then we can have breakfast together when Michael gets up." "Dressed?" I looked down at my nightgown as if I were surprised to discover what I was wearing. "Oh my, I didn't realize. I thought I had gotten dressed already. But if I'm not dressed, then why am I in the kitchen?" Jessica's expression showed the familiar mixture of frustration and concern that had become her standard response to my apparent cognitive problems. "Martha, sometimes, when people are confused, they forget to do things in the right order. Let's get you back to your room so you can put on some clothes." "But I was looking for something important," I insisted, turning back to the refrigerator as if the answer might be hidden behind the milk and leftover casseroles. "I know there was something I needed to find, but I can't remember what it was." Jessica took my arm gently but firmly and began steering me away from the kitchen. Whatever you were looking for can wait until after you're dressed and we've had breakfast. Right now, you need to focus on getting ready for the day. As Jessica guided me back to my room, I allowed myself to appear increasingly agitated and confused about why she was interrupting my search for whatever mysterious item had brought me to the kitchen. I muttered about needing to find it, and expressed frustration that no one understood how important it was, without ever clarifying what it might be. "Martha, there's nothing urgent that you need to find right now," Jessica said with forced patience as she helped me select appropriate clothing from my closet. "Let's focus on getting dressed, and then if you remember what you were looking for, we can help you find it later." "But what if I forget again?" I asked, allowing tears to form in my eyes. "What if it's important, and I forget before I can find it?" Jessica's sigh was audible as she handed me a sweater and helped me understand which arm went into which sleeve. "Martha, if it's really important, you'll remember eventually. Right now, let's just concentrate on one thing at a time." This early morning incident established the tone for what Jessica would later describe as the worst day yet, in terms of my apparent cognitive decline and behavioral problems. But it was only the beginning of what I had planned for November 15th. After breakfast, during which I continued to seem anxious and distracted about the mysterious item I couldn't remember, I began demonstrating what appeared to be increasing confusion about basic daily routines and family relationships. When Jessica reminded me that she needed to go grocery shopping and asked if I wanted to come along or stay home with Michael, I responded as if I had never heard of this routine before. "Grocery shopping? What is grocery shopping?" I asked, looking genuinely puzzled by the concept. "Martha, we go grocery shopping every Tuesday. We drive to the store and buy food for the week. You've come with me several times." "I have? I don't remember going to any store." "Are you sure you're thinking of the right person?" Jessica exchanged a concerned glance with Michael, who had been reading the morning paper but was now paying attention to our conversation. My apparent inability to remember routine activities that had happened multiple times suggested that my memory problems were becoming more severe than they had previously realized. "Mom, you went to the grocery store with Jessica just last week," Michael said carefully. "You helped pick out apples and you commented on how expensive everything had become." I stared at Michael as if he were speaking a foreign language. "I did? I don't remember any of that." "Are you sure it was me? Maybe you're thinking of someone else." The look that passed between Jessica and Michael was significant. It was the moment when they began to realize that my condition might be progressing faster than they had anticipated, and that their current strategies for managing my care might not be adequate for the level of supervision I apparently needed. "Martha, why don't you stay home with Michael today?" Jessica suggested. "I'll do the grocery shopping by myself, and you can rest here where everything is familiar." "But I want to help," I replied, suddenly seeming upset by the suggestion that I should be excluded from normal activities. "I don't want to be left behind like I'm useless." "You're not useless, Martha, but grocery shopping might be overwhelming when you're having trouble remembering things. It's better if you stay somewhere comfortable and safe." "Safe?" I repeated the word as if it had ominous implications. Why wouldn't I be safe? What's going to happen to me? Jessica's patience was already wearing thin, and it wasn't even 9 a.m. yet. "Nothing is going to happen to you, Martha. I just meant that it's easier for you to stay home where you know where everything is and you don't have to worry about getting confused in a busy store." "But I don't want to be a prisoner in this house," I said, allowing my voice to rise slightly with apparent distress. "I want to go places and do things like a normal person." Michael intervened at this point, clearly trying to diffuse what appeared to be an escalating situation. "Mom, you're not a prisoner. We just want to make sure you're comfortable and not overwhelmed by too many changes or stimulation." Quote, "Overwhelmed," I repeated, as if testing the word. "Is that what I am? Overwhelmed?" The conversation continued in this circular pattern for another 20 minutes, with Jessica and Michael attempting to explain concepts that I seemed unable to grasp, while I appeared increasingly agitated by their efforts to manage and control my activities. By the time Jessica finally left for the grocery store, she was visibly frustrated and concerned about leaving me alone with Michael, even though he worked from home and would be available to supervise me. But the real escalation began after Jessica left, and I was alone with Michael. This was when I implemented the most dramatic element of my November 15th performance, an incident that would convince both of them that my condition had reached a crisis point that required immediate intervention. Around 11 a.m., while Michael was working in his home office, I created what appeared to be a genuine emergency. I waited until I could hear him on an important conference call, and then I began calling for help in a voice that sounded panicked and desperate. Michael, help me. Something's wrong. I need help. I could hear Michael apologizing to whoever was on his call and telling them he would have to call back. Within seconds, he was running toward my voice, which was coming from the guest bathroom. Mom, what's wrong? Are you okay? I can't get out. I called through the bathroom door. The door won't open. I'm trapped in here and I can't remember how to get out. Michael tried the door handle and found that it turned normally and the door opened easily. But when he opened it, he found me standing in the middle of the small bathroom, looking genuinely terrified and confused. Mom, the door isn't locked. Look, it opens fine. Michael demonstrated by closing and opening the door several times. But I tried, and it wouldn't open, I said, tears streaming down my face. I thought I was going to be trapped in here forever. I couldn't remember how doors work. Michael's expression showed the deep concern of someone who was witnessing what appeared to be a significant cognitive crisis in a loved one. The idea that I could forget how to open a simple door suggested that my brain injury might be causing more severe problems than anyone had realized. Mom, you're okay now. The door was never locked. Sometimes when people are confused, things seem more complicated than they really are. Quote, but I really couldn't get out, I insisted, still appearing distressed and disoriented. I tried everything I could think of, but nothing worked. What if this happens again? What if I get trapped and you don't hear me calling? Michael helped me sit down in the living room and brought me a glass of water, but I could see that he was deeply shaken by what had just happened. From his perspective, he had just witnessed his mother experience a panic attack triggered by her inability to perform a task that any 3-year-old could manage successfully. Mom, I think we should call Dr. Peterson and tell him about this incident. This level of confusion might indicate that your brain injury is more serious than we initially thought. Do you think there's something really wrong with my brain? I asked, looking at Michael with what appeared to be genuine fear. Am I losing my mind? No, Mom, you're not losing your mind. But you might need different treatment or medication to help with the confusion. Let me call Dr. Peterson and see what he recommends. While Michael was on the phone with the doctor's office, I continued to appear anxious and disoriented, occasionally asking him to repeat what he had said and seeming unable to follow the logic of his explanations about medical care and treatment options. I also began expressing concerns about my safety that would plant seeds for the conversations that Jessica and Michael would have later that day. Michael, what if I forget how to do other important things? What if I can't remember how to turn off the stove or lock the doors? What if I hurt myself or someone else because my brain isn't working right? These questions were designed to make Michael confront the possibility that my apparent condition posed safety risks that might require more intensive supervision than he and Jessica could provide at home. I was giving him legitimate reasons to worry about my welfare, while also making him question whether their current care arrangements were adequate for someone with my apparent level of cognitive impairment. When Jessica returned from grocery shopping around noon, she immediately noticed that something had changed in the household dynamics. Michael met her at the door with a serious expression and quickly explained what had happened while she was gone. Jess, we need to talk. Mom had some kind of episode while you were out. She got confused about how to open the bathroom door and thought she was trapped inside. She was genuinely panicked and seemed to have no memory of how to operate a simple door handle. Jessica's response was immediate concern mixed with frustration. Michael, this is exactly what I've been worried about. Her confusion is getting worse, and we're not equipped to handle this level of cognitive problems. I called Dr. Peterson's office, and they want to see her this afternoon. But Jess, I'm starting to think you might be right about needing to consider other care options. If she's forgetting how to do basic things like opening doors, what other safety issues might we be dealing with? Their conversation continued in the kitchen while I remained in the living room, appearing to watch television but actually listening carefully to every word they said about my condition and their growing concerns about my care needs. Michael, I know this is hard, but we have to face reality. Your mother needs professional care from people who are trained to deal with memory problems and cognitive decline. We're not helping her by pretending we can manage this situation when we clearly can't. But what if she gets worse in a facility? What if being away from family makes her condition deteriorate faster? Michael, what if she gets worse here and we miss something important because we don't know what to look for? What if she has another episode like today and we're not here to help her? What if she gets confused and leaves the house and gets lost? Jessica's questions were designed to make Michael confront the practical realities of caring for someone with apparent severe cognitive impairment. She was systematically addressing his emotional resistance to institutional care by presenting logical arguments about safety and appropriate supervision. I've been researching facilities that specialize in memory care, Jessica continued. There are places that are specifically designed to help people with conditions like your mother's. They have trained staff, secure environments, and programs that are designed to maintain dignity and quality of life, even when cognitive abilities are declining. Michael's resistance was weakening as he processed what had happened that morning alongside Jessica's practical arguments about professional care. Maybe we should at least look at some options and see what's available. I've already scheduled tours at 3 different facilities for next week. I thought we could visit them together and see what they offer, and then we could make an informed decision about what's best for everyone. The fact that Jessica had already scheduled facility tours without consulting me or even telling Michael about her plans revealed exactly how she viewed my role in decisions about my own care and future. She was making arrangements for my life as if I were a child or an incompetent person who couldn't be trusted to participate in choices that would affect my own welfare. But the afternoon and evening of November 15th brought even more dramatic incidents that would convince Jessica and Michael that immediate action was necessary. During my appointment with Dr. Peterson, I demonstrated even more concerning symptoms that suggested my condition was deteriorating rapidly. When Dr. Peterson asked me basic orientation questions, I appeared to be confused about the date, the season, and even which city I was in. When he asked me to remember 3 simple words and repeat them back to him 5 minutes later, I could only recall one of them. When he asked me to draw a simple clock face showing a specific time, my drawing was disorganized and showed significant cognitive impairment. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm concerned about the changes in your cognitive function since your last visit, Dr. Peterson said carefully. The level of confusion and memory problems you're demonstrating today suggests that your brain injury may have caused more significant damage than we initially assessed. What does that mean, doctor? Michael asked while I sat beside him, appearing confused and frightened by the medical discussion. It means that Mrs. Hartwell may need more intensive monitoring and support than family care can typically provide. The safety incident this morning, combined with the cognitive testing results I'm seeing today, suggests that she may be at risk for further episodes that could be dangerous without proper supervision. Dr. Peterson's assessment provided exactly the medical validation that Jessica needed to justify the decisions she was already planning to make about my care. From a professional medical perspective, I appeared to be someone whose condition required specialized intervention that was beyond the scope of family caregiving. What kind of care are you recommending, doctor? Jessica asked. I think we need to consider several options, including medication adjustments, increased home health services, or possibly residential care that specializes in cognitive support. The most important thing is ensuring Mrs. Hartwell's safety while maintaining her dignity and quality of life. The drive home from Dr. Peterson's office was quiet, with Jessica and Michael processing the implications of the medical assessment while I sat in the back seat, appearing confused and upset by the clinical discussions about my condition and future. But I was actually observing their reactions and planning the final elements of my November 15th performance. That evening, I created the most dramatic incident yet, one that would convince Jessica and Michael that immediate action was not just advisable but necessary for everyone's safety and well-being. Around 8 p.m., while Jessica was helping her children with homework and Michael was cleaning up after dinner, I quietly left the house through the back door and walked to the end of their street, where I sat down on a bus bench and waited. My plan was to create what would appear to be a wandering episode, one of the most frightening complications of cognitive decline for families who are trying to provide home care for elderly relatives. 20 minutes later, when Jessica went to check on me and found my room empty, the panic in the house was immediate and genuine. Michael, your mother is gone. She's not in her room. She's not in the bathroom. She's not anywhere in the house. I could hear the sounds of frantic searching, with Jessica and Michael calling my name throughout the house and checking every possible location where I might have gone. Within minutes, they were outside with flashlights, searching the yard and the immediate neighborhood, while Jessica called the police to report a missing elderly person with cognitive impairment. "She's wearing a blue sweater and gray pants," Jessica told the 911 dispatcher. "She has dementia and gets confused easily. She might not remember her address or phone number if someone finds her." The search continued for 45 minutes, with neighbors joining the effort and police officers arriving to coordinate a more systematic search of the area. I remained seated on the bus bench, visible from the street but far enough away that the searchers didn't immediately notice me in the darkness. When Michael finally spotted me and called out to the others that he had found me, I was ready with a performance that would complete my November 15th demonstration of apparent cognitive crisis. Mom, thank God you're okay. What are you doing out here? We've been looking everywhere for you." I looked up at Michael with an expression of complete confusion and fear. "Michael, what are you doing here? How did you find me?" "Mom, you left the house. You've been missing for almost an hour. We were terrified that something had happened to you." "I left the house?" I appeared genuinely surprised by this information. "I don't remember leaving the house. Why would I leave the house?" Jessica arrived breathless from running, followed by 2 police officers who needed to confirm that I was safe and assess whether any medical intervention was required. "Martha, you scared us to death," Jessica said, her voice shaking with what appeared to be genuine fear and relief. "You left without telling anyone where you were going. We didn't know if you were hurt or lost or what had happened to you." "But I didn't go anywhere," I insisted, still appearing confused by everyone's concern. "I've been sitting right here the whole time. I was waiting for the bus to take me home." "Mom, you are home," Michael said gently. "You live with us, remember? You've been staying in our guest room since August." I stared at Michael as if he were telling me something impossible. "I live with you? But that can't be right. I live alone in my own apartment. I was waiting for the bus to take me home to my apartment." The police officers exchanged glances that suggested they were observing a textbook case of elderly wandering behavior associated with dementia or cognitive impairment. One of them began asking me basic questions about the date, my address, and my family members, and I provided answers that were inconsistent and confused. "Ma'am, do you know what month it is? It's summer, isn't it? July? Or maybe August?" "Ma'am, it's November. Do you remember what year it is?" This year is 2018? Or is it 2019? I'm sorry, I get confused about time sometimes." The police officers recommended that Jessica and Michael contact my doctor immediately and consider increasing my level of supervision to prevent future wandering episodes. They also provided information about safety devices and monitoring systems that were designed to help families track elderly relatives who were prone to becoming lost or disoriented. As we walked back to the house, with Jessica holding one of my arms and Michael holding the other, I continued to appear confused about why everyone was so upset and why I couldn't remember leaving the house or walking to the bus bench. "I don't understand why you're all so worried," I said as we reached the front door. "I was just waiting for the bus. I do that every day." "Martha, you don't take the bus every day," Jessica said with forced patience. "You live here with us, and you don't need to take the bus anywhere." "But if I don't take the bus, how do I get home to my apartment?" The circular conversation continued as Jessica and Michael helped me back into the house and tried to reorient me to my actual living situation and the reality of my current circumstances. But from their perspective, they had just witnessed a dangerous wandering episode that could have resulted in serious injury, or worse, if I hadn't been found quickly. That night, after I had supposedly gone to bed, I listened to Jessica and Michael's conversation about the day's events and their growing certainty that immediate action was required. "Michael, we cannot continue like this," Jessica said, her voice filled with exhaustion and stress. "Your mother is becoming a danger to herself and potentially to us. What if she had gotten hit by a car? What if she had gotten truly lost and we couldn't find her? What if this happens again when we're both at work and the kids are at school?" "I know you're right, Jess. Today was a wake-up call. I can't keep pretending that we can handle this level of care on our own. Michael, I've been patient and I've tried to be supportive, but I have to think about our children's safety and well-being too. Emma and Jake were terrified when they realized their grandmother was missing. This level of crisis and chaos isn't fair to them. What are you saying, Jess? I'm saying that we need to make some hard decisions about your mother's care, and we need to make them soon. I can't live in constant fear that she's going to wander off or hurt herself or create some other emergency that we're not equipped to handle. Their conversation revealed that November 15th had achieved exactly what I had intended it to achieve. Jessica and Michael were no longer debating whether professional care might be advisable in the future. They were convinced that immediate action was necessary for everyone's safety and well-being. Over the next week, Jessica accelerated her research into care facilities and began making concrete plans for my transition to institutional care. She scheduled the facility tours she had mentioned, researched admission procedures, and began investigating the legal and financial requirements for placing an elderly relative in professional care. Most tellingly, these plans were made without any meaningful consultation with me about my preferences, needs, or desires regarding my own future care. Jessica and Michael had decided that I was no longer competent to participate in decisions about my own life, and they were proceeding with arrangements that they believed were in my best interest, regardless of what I might want or need. The November 15th crisis had accomplished everything I had planned. It had forced Jessica and Michael to reveal their true attitudes about elderly care, family responsibility, and decision-making authority when dealing with someone they believed was cognitively impaired. It had demonstrated their willingness to make major life decisions for another adult without that person's input or consent. And it had pushed them to the point where they were ready to take definitive action that would reveal their character once and for all. Because 8 days later, on November 23rd, Jessica would make the declaration that would trigger the revelation that would change all of their lives forever. Martha, you're too old to live here anymore. It's time you moved to one of those senior places where you can get proper care. And that was the moment when 3 months of careful planning and strategic performance would pay off in ways that Jessica and Michael could never have imagined possible. But to understand the full magnitude of what Jessica and Michael were about to discover, you need to know who I really was during those 3 months when they believed they were caring for a declining elderly woman with cognitive impairment. You need to understand the sophisticated business operations I was managing from their guest room, the strategic decisions I was making while pretending to be confused about how to operate a coffee maker, and the financial empire I was building while they worried about my ability to afford professional care. The truth was that Martha Elizabeth Hartwell wasn't just a successful businesswoman. I was one of the most accomplished real estate investors in the Pacific Northwest, with a portfolio that had grown from a modest inheritance into a multi-million-dollar empire over the course of 30 years. While Jessica and Michael saw me fumbling with simple household tasks, I was actually monitoring property values, managing tenant relationships, and executing investment strategies that generated more income in a single month than Michael earned in an entire year. Every morning at 5 a.m., while my family slept and assumed I was resting peacefully in my guest room, I was already awake and working. I had converted the walk-in closet in my room into a sophisticated command center, complete with multiple monitors, secure internet connections, and communication systems that allowed me to manage my business operations without anyone in the house knowing what I was actually doing. The confused old woman who seemed overwhelmed by modern technology was actually using advanced property management software to oversee 13 rental properties across Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver. While Jessica worried about my ability to remember simple instructions, I was analyzing market trends, reviewing financial reports, and making investment decisions that required complex mathematical calculations and strategic thinking. The trembling hands that couldn't seem to button sweaters properly were actually typing emails to property managers, reviewing lease agreements, and negotiating purchase contracts for new acquisitions. The woman who appeared to have trouble remembering what day of the week it was, actually maintaining detailed calendars that tracked maintenance schedules, lease renewals, and inspection dates for dozens of properties across 3 states. During those 3 months, when Jessica and Michael believed I was becoming increasingly dependent on their care, I was actually expanding my business operations and implementing new strategies that would increase my passive income by 40% over the following year. The morning hours when they thought I was sleeping late due to age and medication were actually spent conducting virtual meetings with real estate agents, property inspectors, and financial advisors who helped me identify and acquire undervalued properties in emerging markets. The manila envelope that I would eventually place on Jessica's kitchen counter contained documentation of business activities that most professional investors would have been proud to claim as their own achievements. But more than just financial success, those documents represented 30 years of strategic thinking, careful planning, and disciplined execution that had transformed a modest inheritance from my late husband into one of the most successful individual real estate portfolios on the West Coast. My husband Robert had been a small-scale landlord who owned 3 rental properties when he passed away 15 years earlier. He had been conservative in his investments, preferring stable, predictable returns to aggressive growth strategies. When I inherited his properties and his modest savings, most people expected me to sell everything and live comfortably on the proceeds for the rest of my life. Instead, I had used Robert's foundation to build something extraordinary. I studied real estate markets with the intensity of a graduate student, learning about demographic trends, economic indicators, and neighborhood development patterns that most investors overlooked. I developed relationships with real estate professionals who respected my knowledge and treated me as a serious investor, rather than a vulnerable widow who needed protection from complex financial decisions. Within 5 years of Robert's death, I had doubled the size of my property portfolio and tripled my annual rental income. I had identified emerging neighborhoods before they became popular, purchased properties at below-market prices, and improved them in ways that attracted high-quality tenants and commanded premium rents. But my real breakthrough came when I began focusing on a specific niche that other investors had largely ignored: housing for aging populations. While most real estate investors were chasing young professionals and families, I recognized that the fastest-growing demographic group was elderly individuals who wanted to age in place but needed housing that was designed for their changing needs. I began acquiring and renovating properties specifically for elderly tenants, installing accessibility features, safety modifications, and convenience amenities that allowed people to maintain independence while addressing the physical challenges that come with aging. My properties became known throughout the Portland area as the premier housing options for active seniors who wanted dignity and autonomy without sacrificing safety or comfort. This specialization required me to become expert in areas that most landlords never considered: universal design principles, medical equipment accommodation, emergency response systems, and the complex regulations governing housing for elderly and disabled individuals. I worked with occupational therapists, accessibility consultants, and elder care specialists to create living environments that were both comfortable and supportive. The success of this strategy was extraordinary. My senior-focused properties had waiting lists of potential tenants, commanded rental rates that were 15 to 20% above market averages, and had tenant retention rates that exceeded 90%. I was providing a service that the market desperately needed while generating exceptional returns on my investments. Over the past 10 years, I had expanded this concept into what had become essentially a boutique real estate empire. I owned 13 properties specifically designed for elderly tenants, ranging from converted single-family homes to small apartment complexes that I had purchased and renovated to meet the unique needs of aging populations. But beyond the rental properties, I had also developed expertise in real estate rehabilitation and resale. I would identify properties that were structurally sound but cosmetically outdated, purchase them at below-market prices, renovate them with high-quality improvements, and either rent them to carefully selected tenants or sell them for substantial profits. This combination of rental income and renovation profits had generated wealth at a rate that exceeded most professional investment portfolios. My average annual return over the past decade had been 22%, and my properties had appreciated in value by an average of 8% per year beyond the income they generated. During the 3 months when Jessica and Michael believed I was experiencing cognitive decline, I had actually completed the acquisition and renovation of 2 additional properties, negotiated lease renewals that increased my annual rental income by $47,000, and identified 3 more potential acquisitions that were scheduled for purchase over the following 6 months. The confused woman who seemed to have trouble following simple conversations was actually managing relationships with 43 tenants, coordinating with 12 different contractors and service providers, and maintaining detailed financial records that would have impressed any professional accountant. The morning phone calls that Jessica and Michael occasionally overheard and dismissed as social conversations with old friends were actually business discussions with property managers, real estate agents, and financial advisors who helped me stay current with market conditions and regulatory changes that affected my investments. The mail that arrived for me and appeared to be routine correspondence about modest savings accounts was actually communication from banks, investment firms, and legal professionals who managed the complex financial and legal aspects of my business operations. When Jessica worried about my ability to afford assisted living care, she had no idea that my monthly passive income from rental properties was $34,000 and that my liquid assets exceeded $2.3 million. When Michael researched the costs of professional elder care and wondered how we would pay for quality services, he didn't know that I could have purchased the most expensive care facility in Portland and still maintained my standard of living indefinitely. The woman they believed needed their financial support and protection was actually someone who could have solved all of their financial problems with a single phone call. Michael's struggling engineering consulting business could have been rescued with an investment that represented less than 2% of my liquid assets. The mortgage on their house that they worried about during economic uncertainties could have been paid off with funds that I earned in rental income every 3 months. But my financial success wasn't just about accumulating wealth. It was about building something meaningful that provided value to other people while generating the resources that would allow me to live with dignity and independence for the rest of my life. My properties housed elderly individuals who might otherwise have been forced into institutional care, and my business model proved that treating tenants with respect and providing high-quality housing was not just morally right but also financially successful. The renovation projects I managed had revitalized neighborhoods, increased property values for other homeowners, and created employment for local contractors and craftspeople who specialized in accessibility improvements and aging-in-place modifications. My investments had positive impacts that extended far beyond my own financial returns. Most importantly, my business success had been achieved while maintaining the highest ethical standards and treating everyone involved with dignity and respect. My tenants regarded me as a caring landlord who prioritized their comfort and safety over maximum profit extraction. My contractors and service providers knew me as someone who paid fairly and promptly while expecting high-quality work and professional service. The real estate professionals I worked with respected my knowledge and expertise, often seeking my advice about market trends and investment strategies. Financial advisors and legal professionals regarded me as a sophisticated client, whose business acumen and ethical practices made our professional relationships both profitable and personally satisfying. During those 3 months when Jessica and Michael were observing what they believed was cognitive decline, I was actually operating at the peak of my professional capabilities. I was making complex business decisions that required analytical thinking, strategic planning, and detailed knowledge of legal and financial regulations. I was managing multiple projects simultaneously while maintaining the personal relationships that were essential to my business success. The irony was that my apparent helplessness and confusion were actually the result of sophisticated performance skills that required intelligence, creativity, and careful planning to execute convincingly. The woman who seemed unable to remember simple instructions was actually maintaining detailed mental notes about every conversation, every assumption, and every revealing comment that Jessica and Michael made about their true attitudes toward elderly family members. Every morning after completing my business activities and before Jessica and Michael woke up, I would spend an hour documenting their behavior, recording their conversations, and analyzing their responses to my apparent needs and limitations. I was conducting the most comprehensive character assessment of my life, using methods that required psychological insight, strategic thinking, and emotional intelligence that contradicted everything they believed about my mental capabilities. The declining woman who appeared to be losing her memory was actually building a detailed case file about how her family treated someone they believed was vulnerable and dependent. I was gathering evidence that would support the most important decision I would ever make about my legacy, my assets, and my family relationships. Because while Jessica and Michael were planning my future based on their assumptions about my limitations, I was planning their future based on careful observation of their character. While they were researching care facilities and discussing guardianship procedures, I was preparing documents that would demonstrate exactly how wrong their assumptions about my capabilities had been. The manila envelope that would soon shock them with its contents wasn't just financial documentation. It was the culmination of 3 months of testing their values, their compassion, and their respect for elderly family members. It contained proof not just of my business success, but of their moral failure when dealing with someone they believed couldn't defend herself or challenge their decisions. And most devastatingly, it contained legal documents that would show them exactly what their treatment of me was going to cost them in terms of inheritance, family relationships, and future financial security. Because the woman they had dismissed as irrelevant to their lives was actually the person who controlled their financial future in ways they had never imagined possible. The real Martha Hartwell wasn't just a successful businesswoman. I was someone who understood that respect and dignity weren't negotiable, regardless of age or apparent circumstances. And I was about to teach Jessica and Michael the most expensive lesson they would ever learn about the consequences of assuming you know someone's worth based on superficial appearances. Who occasionally interacted with me during my walks around the block, saw an elderly woman who moved slowly, seemed occasionally disoriented, and was fortunate to have family members who supervised her activities and ensured her safety. When Jessica or Michael accompanied me on these outings, other residents of their neighborhood saw responsible adult children taking appropriate precautions with an aging parent who could no longer be trusted to navigate the world independently. The salespeople at stores where Jessica took me for errands and appointments saw exactly what thousands of other retail workers see every day: an elderly customer who needed extra time and assistance, who seemed confused by simple transactions, and who was fortunate to have a patient family member helping her manage tasks that had become overwhelming. When Jessica spoke for me or made decisions about purchases, they saw appropriate advocacy for someone whose judgment and communication skills had become unreliable. Even the staff at the assisted living facilities that Jessica researched saw nothing unusual about our situation when we toured their memory care units and discussed admission procedures. They dealt with hundreds of families making similar decisions about elderly relatives whose cognitive abilities had declined to the point where professional care was necessary for safety and quality of life. My apparent confusion during facility tours and my emotional responses to discussions about placement seemed completely normal for someone facing the difficult transition from independent living to supervised care. The social workers, financial advisors, and legal professionals who consulted with Michael and Jessica about elder care planning saw a typical family dealing with the complex challenges of caring for an aging parent whose needs had exceeded what home care could provide. Their advice about guardianship procedures, asset management, and care transition planning was based on their assumption that I was someone who could no longer make informed decisions about my own welfare and finances. Insurance representatives who discussed coverage for my care saw documentation of cognitive decline that justified recommendations for specialized services and support systems. Medical equipment suppliers who delivered safety devices and mobility aids to Michael's house saw a family making appropriate preparations for an elderly relative whose physical and cognitive limitations required environmental modifications and assistive technology. From every professional and social perspective, Michael and Jessica appeared to be handling a difficult situation with appropriate care, research, and planning. Their decisions seemed not just reasonable but commendable, given the challenges of providing elder care without professional training or unlimited resources. Their stress and frustration seemed natural and understandable, rather than evidence of character flaws or lack of compassion. Most telling of all was how completely convinced Jessica and Michael had become of their own perceptions. They weren't just pretending to believe I was declining. They had genuinely convinced themselves that everything they observed confirmed their assumptions about my condition. They had interpreted every interaction through the lens of cognitive impairment, and they had explained away any evidence that contradicted their conclusions about my limitations. When I demonstrated detailed knowledge about topics that should have been beyond my apparent cognitive abilities, they assumed I was accessing old memories rather than current expertise. When I showed frustration with their treatment of me, they attributed my emotional responses to the confusion and agitation that often accompany dementia. When I asked questions about their plans for my care, they saw anxiety and fear rather than strategic information gathering. Their certainty about my condition was so complete that they never considered the possibility that my behavior might be intentional rather than symptomatic. They never questioned whether someone with my apparent limitations could be capable of strategic thinking, careful planning, or sophisticated deception. They never wondered whether the woman they were observing might be different from the woman they thought they knew. And that absolute certainty, that complete conviction that they understood my situation and were making appropriate decisions for my welfare, was exactly what made the revelation in that manila envelope so perfectly devastating when it finally came. Because Jessica and Michael hadn't just made mistakes about my condition, they had built their entire understanding of our family relationships on assumptions that were not just wrong, but deliberately constructed to test exactly how they would treat someone they believed was vulnerable and dependent on their care. They had passed 3 months demonstrating their true character when they thought no one was keeping score, revealing their attitudes about elder care, dignity, and family responsibility when they believed their choices couldn't be challenged or their assumptions questioned. And they were about to discover that the confused, declining elderly woman they had been planning to place in professional care was actually someone who had been evaluating their character, documenting their choices, and preparing consequences that would match exactly how they had chosen to treat someone they believed was powerless to resist their decisions. The most expensive lessons are often the ones about assumptions, and Jessica and Michael were about to receive an education that would cost them everything they thought they understood about their own family, their own character, and their own future.